I never thought a place could go silent in a way that actually hurts your ears, but that's exactly what hit me the moment I stepped back onto my land on Silverpine Lake and saw nothing where the ice vault used to be. I'm talking about something that should not have been touched, not misunderstood, not even debated for a second. Gone, reduced to broken stone and dust like it never mattered. And the strangest part is, I didn't even find out from a neighbor or a phone call. I found out the way you find out something is wrong in a dream. You just see it, and your brain refuses to accept it for a few seconds. My name is Evan Carter, and I've lived on this lake property since 2010, 21 acres of shoreline that my family's been tied to in one way or another for generations. But the heart of it, the thing that made it different from every other piece of land out here, was the stone ice vault near the northern bend, built sometime in the 1850s when this whole region still ran on sawmills, rail lines, and winters so harsh people literally stored frozen blocks underground just to survive summer. That structure stood 20 feet tall, thick stone walls, original insulation packed between layers like some kind of forgotten engineering miracle, and for me it was never just old history. It was a living piece of it, something I used to show school groups every spring when teachers brought kids out here thinking they were just going on a nature tour. I'd stand there in the morning light, pointing at the iron hooks still embedded in the stone, telling them how ice used to be cut from the lake and stored here before electricity even made that idea sound primitive instead of genius. And I swear, every time I told that story, I felt like I was borrowing time from people who built things to last longer than they ever did. Nobody ever questioned my boundaries either. Not for years. The survey lines were clean, the deed history was clean, everything about the place felt settled in that quiet American way where land just is. That changed the day Caleb Morgan and his wife Lillian moved in next door. They came from Seattle. Big glass and wood modern house dropped right onto the shoreline like it was trying to impress the lake into liking it back. And at first, I'll be honest, they seemed fine, the kind of polite that doesn't ask for anything and doesn't give you any reason to think twice. I met Caleb the same way you meet most neighbors in places like this, randomly. Out by the water while I was walking a group of kids through the ice vault tour, he stopped at the fence line, smiled like he had all the time in the world, asked a few questions about the structure, nodded like he understood it mattered. I remember telling him, casually, like I always do, that I'd been here since 2010 and that the ice vault was part of a preserved rail-era system that once supplied the entire lakeshore region. And he gave that slow, thoughtful nod people give when they're deciding whether something is interesting or just inconvenient. I didn't think much of it. People move in, people ask questions, life goes on. But looking back now, I can almost pinpoint the exact moment something shifted, even if I didn't recognize it at the time, because there's a certain kind of smile people give when they're not really listening. They're already editing your world into something they prefer, and Caleb had that smile down to an art. Weeks passed normally, then months, and I had to leave town for what was supposed to be a short research trip, glacier studies up north. The kind of work I've always done on the side because history and ice have a way of overlapping more than people think, and I left the property in what I assumed was perfect condition, quiet, untouched, exactly the way it had always been. I remember standing on the dock the morning I left, looking back at the ice vault one last time like you do without realizing you're doing it. That unconscious check your brain makes when it thinks everything important will still be there when you return. It wasn't even a thought, really, just routine. I left. I worked. I came back 13 weeks later. And I swear to you, I knew something was wrong before I even parked the truck. The air felt different, like the land had exhaled something it couldn't take back. When I walked down toward the northern bend, I expected shadows. I expected quiet stone. I expected the same familiar outline I had seen 1,000 times in different seasons. Instead, there was rubble. Just rubble. Broken limestone, scattered insulation material, rusted fragments of iron hooks torn out like someone had ripped pages out of a book and then burned the book just to make sure it couldn't be read again. I stood there longer than I should have, not moving, not speaking, just trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew was supposed to exist there. It's a strange thing, grief over a building, but that's what it felt like, because it wasn't just destruction, it was erasure. Finally, I pulled out my phone and called Caleb. He answered like I was interrupting something casual, like I was asking about the weather instead of a 170-year-old structure being reduced to gravel. "Hey," he said, like nothing in the world had changed. I didn't even raise my voice at first. I just told him I was standing in front of where the ice vault used to be. There was a pause, short, almost bored. Then he said it. Oh, that thing. Yeah, we had it cleared. It looked like an old collapsing shed. Honestly, we thought it was unsafe. I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because my brain couldn't decide how else to respond. I told him it wasn't a shed. It was a protected landmark structure, fully documented, surveyed, registered, something you don't clear, something you don't just decide is ugly and remove. And that's when his tone changed. Just slightly, not apologetic, not nervous, just indifferent. He said their designer thought it ruined the waterfront aesthetic, and since it was technically on what they believed was shared visual space, they went ahead and removed it. I told him there was no such thing as shared visual space in property law, and that the structure was entirely on my land. He paused again, then said something I'll never forget because of how casually it was delivered. Well, it's gone now. If you've got a problem with it, lawyer up. That was the moment the silence in my chest turned into something heavier. Not anger yet, not fully, just this slow sinking realization that I wasn't dealing with misunderstanding. I was dealing with entitlement. I walked back up to the house without really remembering the steps, and sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing until the reality finally settled in fully. The ice vault wasn't damaged, it wasn't partially destroyed, it was gone, and the people next door didn't see that as a problem worth solving. They saw it as an improvement. I made one more call that night, not to Caleb, but to a man I'd worked with years ago, a property attorney named Malcolm Vance, the kind of lawyer who doesn't speak much until he's already figured out how to win. I told him everything, and for a long time he didn't interrupt, just listened. When I finished, he finally said something calm, almost matter-of-fact, that I didn't fully understand in the moment. If what you're saying is documented, then this isn't a disagreement. It's a landmark violation with property destruction attached. He told me to send everything: deeds, surveys, registry documents, photos, and not to contact the neighbors again until he reviewed it all. That night I sat in my office looking at old photographs of the ice vault, trying to understand how something that had survived over a century and a half could disappear in 13 weeks because someone thought it didn't match their aesthetic. And what I didn't know yet, what I couldn't possibly see from that moment of quiet disbelief, was that this wasn't going to end with a simple apology or a repair, because Caleb Morgan wasn't just careless. He was already building something where my history used to stand, and by the time I realized what he was doing, it would be too late for anything except consequences. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was angry in the loud sense, but because my mind kept replaying that empty space down by the lake like it was stuck on a loop I couldn't shut off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stone outline that used to be there, then the absence of it, then Caleb's voice saying it looked like an old shed, and somehow the most disturbing part wasn't even the destruction itself. It was how easily he had justified it, like history was just another inconvenience you could schedule out with a contractor. By morning, Malcolm Vance had already called me back, and his tone had shifted from calm curiosity to something more serious. The kind of seriousness lawyers use when they already see where a case is heading. He told me to send everything immediately, every survey map, every historical registry document, every photo I had ever taken of the ice vault, including the ones from those school tours. And so I spent hours digging through old folders, pulling up images of kids standing in front of that structure smiling, completely unaware they were standing next to something that would one day be treated like trash. When I sent it all, Malcolm went quiet for a long time, then finally said what I already knew but needed to hear from someone else. This wasn't ambiguous. This is protected historical property, fully documented. They didn't just demolish a structure, they interfered with registered preservation land. And that was when the tone of everything changed, because now it wasn't about feelings or neighbor disputes anymore. It was about legal exposure, liability, and value. He asked me one question I didn't expect. Do you want restoration, or do you want equivalent enforcement? I didn't answer immediately, because the truth is I wasn't thinking about revenge at that moment. I was still stuck on the idea that something irreplaceable had been treated like a landscaping problem. But then I thought about it properly, about what it takes to tear down something built in the 1850s, and I said, slowly, I want it corrected. Properly. Malcolm exhaled like he'd expected that answer. Then we quantify it. That word, quantify, sat in my head in a strange way, because how do you quantify something like that? How do you assign a number to a structure that outlived railroads, wars, entire generations, and still stood until someone decided it was in the way of a nicer view? Meanwhile, I started noticing activity next door that I hadn't paid attention to before I left for Iceland. Trucks coming in early mornings, surveyors marking sections near the shoreline. And then one afternoon I saw it clearly, construction staking directly where the ice vault had stood. I walked down to the property line and just stood there watching as workers measured and chalked out what looked like a lakeside cabana structure. Modern wood framing, glass panels, a private dock expansion. All of it placed almost deliberately over the footprint of what used to be my landmark. That was the moment my disbelief finally turned into something colder, because this wasn't ignorance anymore. This was confidence built on assumption. The assumption that once something is gone, it stays gone, and no one will ever come back to question it. I called Caleb that same afternoon. He answered again like we were acquaintances discussing minor inconveniences. I asked him if he knew they were building directly over a registered landmark site. He laughed lightly, like I had told a joke. Your old shed? Evan, come on. We checked with our designer, and the county records didn't show anything significant there. I told him the county records were irrelevant compared to the State Preservation Registry and the official survey map, and there was a pause on the line, a small one, just long enough for me to hear someone in the background talking about materials delivery. Then he said something worse than denial. He said certainty. Look, our lawyer already cleared everything. If you had something real, you would have stopped us already. And that's when I realized what kind of conflict this actually was going to be, not a misunderstanding, not a neighbor dispute, but a confidence game built on who believed their paperwork mattered more. I hung up and forwarded everything to Malcolm immediately. 2 days later, he called me back with a tone that had shifted again, now focused, precise, almost surgical. They've created a legal problem for themselves, he said. Because they didn't just remove a structure, they replaced it with construction in a protected zone. That turns this into ongoing violation, not just past damage. He paused, then added, we can pursue damages, but more importantly, we can seek authorization for equivalent corrective action. I asked him what that meant, and he said something I won't forget. It means if a court agrees, you don't just get compensated, you get symmetry. Over the next few weeks, everything moved in layers I didn't fully see at the time. Filings, responses, counterclaims from Caleb's legal team arguing the ice vault was unsafe and non-essential, offering me what they called a goodwill settlement of $45,000 for historical acknowledgement, which honestly felt like an insult designed by someone who had never stood in front of something older than their own career. Malcolm rejected it immediately. Then came the escalation, because Caleb didn't stop construction. In fact, he accelerated it, as if finishing the cabana faster would somehow make the argument disappear. And I remember standing on my porch one evening watching lights on their property glow against the lake, while the outline of the new structure started to rise exactly where mine had been erased. And I felt this strange mixture of disbelief and clarity settle in, because now I understood something simple. They didn't think they had destroyed anything. They thought they had upgraded the land. The hearing was scheduled for late spring, and I didn't expect much from it beyond paperwork and procedural arguments. But when Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered the case, it became clear very quickly that this wasn't going to stay theoretical. Malcolm laid out everything. The original survey, the landmark registration, the photographic evidence, the timeline of demolition, and then the construction records showing Caleb's new structure occupying the exact footprint. Caleb's attorney argued aesthetics, safety concerns, and lack of visible registry markers. But the judge cut through it with a kind of quiet precision that made the entire room feel smaller. Absence of awareness, she said, is not authorization for destruction. Then she leaned forward, looking directly at Caleb's side of the room, and continued. You demolished a documented historical structure on private land and proceeded to build in its place without resolution of ownership or status. That constitutes continuing violation. I remember Caleb shifting in his seat at that moment. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment, the kind people make when they realize the ground beneath their argument is no longer stable. After a short recess, the ruling came down, and it was simple in wording but heavy in consequence. The court recognized the ice vault as a protected historical structure wrongfully demolished, awarded authorization for equivalent valuation enforcement, and allowed corrective removal of newly constructed improvements within the disputed footprint pending damages assessment. I remember sitting there not feeling victorious, just aligned, like something that had been out of balance for months was finally being acknowledged by a system larger than me. And outside the courthouse, I saw Caleb for the first time since everything started, standing near his lawyer, looking less confident than he had sounded on the phone. And when our eyes met, he didn't say anything, just turned away like the conversation had already ended somewhere he didn't control anymore. That night, I went back home and stood by the lake for a long time, listening to the wind move across the water, thinking about how quickly people can erase something they don't understand, and how slowly truth sometimes has to move before it catches up. And what I didn't realize yet was that the hardest part wasn't the loss anymore. It was what the court was about to allow me to do next. I got the call from Malcolm just after sunrise, and I knew before I even spoke that this wasn't going to be another update. His voice was too steady, too final, like everything that had been building for weeks had finally reached the point where it stopped being discussion and turned into execution. He told me the court order was signed, full authorization granted for equivalent corrective action, damages confirmed, enforcement cleared, and for a few seconds I didn't even respond because I was just standing there in my kitchen looking out at Silver Pine Lake, thinking how strange it is that a place can stay physically the same while everything attached to it changes shape in your life. By mid-morning, the trucks started arriving, not in some chaotic, dramatic way, but in that controlled professional rhythm that makes everything feel more official than emotional. Survey markers first, then legal observers, then the demolition crew, all of it documented like a slow unwinding of something that should never have been built in the first place. And I remember standing near the window watching it all come and thinking, this is what consequences look like when they finally arrive late, but fully formed. Caleb showed up before anything started, almost like he had been waiting for the exact moment he could try to argue his way out of reality. He walked fast, already talking before he reached me, saying this was his shoreline project, his investment, that everything had permits, approvals, county sign-off, all of it. But his words felt different now, not confident anymore. More like someone repeating instructions that used to work in a world that no longer exists. I didn't argue with him. I just handed him the court order. He didn't open it immediately, just held it in his hand like it weighed more than paper should. And for the first time I saw something behind his expression that wasn't arrogance or dismissal. It was uncertainty, the kind that shows up too late to be useful. The demolition began at the dock structure, right where the new cabana met the water, and that was the part that hit me in a way I didn't expect, because there's a sound to professional teardown that doesn't feel like chaos. It feels like reversal, like the land is being carefully restored to a previous sentence one piece at a time. I stood there watching sections come down that had replaced something I still couldn't fully believe was gone, and I kept waiting to feel something sharp, anger, satisfaction, anything strong enough to match what had happened to me. But what came instead was quieter, heavier, almost like exhaustion finally catching up. Caleb stayed there the entire time, pacing at first, then stopping, then just standing still, and at some point he started talking again, not to convince me anymore, but to convince himself, saying things about property value, waterfront planning, design approval, but every sentence sounded thinner than the last, like it was losing support midair. By the second day, most of the structure was already gone, glass panels removed, framing broken down into stacked wood and metal that looked far less important on the ground than it ever did standing over the water, and I walked down closer during a pause in the work, just to see it from where it had actually been anchored. And that's when Caleb came closer too, slower this time, like the urgency had drained out of him. He stopped a few feet away and said something I didn't expect, not anger, not threat, just a kind of tired honesty. I didn't think it mattered that much. And I remember looking at him for a second longer than I probably should have, because I actually believed him, and that belief made it heavier, not lighter, because that was always the gap between us. I saw something that meant history. He saw something that meant obstruction. I told him, quietly, that's not how ownership works when history is involved, and I don't even think he really heard me at that point. By the third day, the shoreline was clear again. Not restored, not repaired, just stripped back to a neutral state where nothing new was sitting on top of what had been erased, and I stood there for a long time after the crews left, just listening to the water and the wind like they were trying to say something that didn't need translation. Malcolm called again that evening to confirm the final financial judgment, damages, legal fees, penalties, all of it stacked in a way that turned what Caleb had dismissed as a simple misunderstanding into something far more expensive than he ever expected, and he mentioned that the appeal attempt had already been rejected before it even reached full review because the preservation violation was too clear, too documented, too complete. That should have felt like closure, and maybe in a legal sense it was. But standing there at night looking across the lake, I kept seeing the outline of the ice vault in my head more clearly than anything that had replaced it. And that's when it really sank in that some things don't come back just because the system agrees with you. And that's the part one still think about the most. Not the demolition, not the court, not even Caleb standing there watching his structure come down, but the realization that even when everything goes exactly the way it's supposed to, you can still end up with a kind of silence that feels unfinished.